Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Shirkers. Shirkers is a very interesting and unique documentary, and as soon as I heard of the concept, I wanted to see it because it sounded incredibly unique. It's about a filmmaker, Sandy Tan, who directed this film. She, alongside her friends, Jasmine and Sophie, decided to make this film Shirkers between people who are, I forget what a shirker is, but that's whatever, and was directed by their film teacher, George Cardano, I think. And they shot this independent film all over Singapore, and it was going to be a road movie, even though Singapore is not that big, but whatever. After wrapping, they left the footage with the director, because, why wouldn't you do that? And the rest of them went off to college, and then the director disappeared, and he took the footage, and those three didn't see him or the footage ever again. And then 20 years later, after George's death, Sandy Tan was contacted by his widow or his former wife or his whatever, and told that she had the film but didn't have the audio tracks. And then she made a documentary about the mystery of the production of that film, how she met George, everything like that. And that's basically what Shirkers is. Just the lore of that is fascinating enough to watch this movie and makes this film juicy and interesting. You feel like you're going into forgotten history, and in terms of Singaporean film, this was a major kind of lost media type of thing, especially because lost media is more of a thing. This is kind of like a fascinating portrait and a window to go through. But I also kind of look at this as someone, as myself, who has made quite a few things and has had quite a few things that I've spent lots and lots of time on go practically nowhere, especially because sometimes you will get really involved in that. They'll make money off this thing, they'll pay you, you'll get far because of your connection to that thing, and nothing. And that's happened to me a lot of times, and it's nothing you've ever heard of from no one you've ever heard of. Well, that might not be true. I've had so many times where I'll be talking to a filmmaking buddy or someone who makes content, and we'll have a long conversation about all the crap that we've worked on that has never come out, or has just been delayed indefinitely and then eventually does come out, or things we've been paid for to work on that has never happened. And that's just sort of life, unfortunately. That's the creative process. You might go, it won't happen to me. It will. Don't ever say that. It will definitely happen to you. You might luckily find a way to repurpose things, much like she has with this documentary. She found a way to take that footage and make it into something, and what she did is she made it into this documentary about the history of it, which I think makes it way more interesting. Part of me wouldn't mind if she did more. I'm sure there's more you could do with the footage. If we were still in the era of DVD, this was released on Netflix, which I think helped, because I feel like, especially in my life now, I don't know how I would get around to seeing something like this, and especially documentaries, something that's kind of so obscure as this. I don't know necessarily if it would, but I definitely think she gets into the lore of understanding each of these people, understanding how you behaved while you're working on some of these things, especially when you get older. I think oftentimes with these stories, and if you have a project that you worked on, at first you just talk about how you did all this shit and you did this thing and you're so important and you should be justified in making this stupid thing or whatever. And then like years later you're like, wow, I was an asshole. And she says that in this, about how she's an asshole, about how her friend, who like went on to shoot tons of like very well regarded films, she's just shooting her wedding and she's like correcting her, and she's like, I was totally an asshole. And I think that's something that even stuff you have worked on that got to be things, so like you later think of that and you're like, oh wow, maybe I went too far. I was so into it and getting this thing done that I didn't. And I think that comes with like working on anything, but I think in the creative process it can happen, especially when you're young and very ambitious and you're just hungry to finally work on something. It's just like those first couple years you're just like so into it, it's like gross. Like I'd say the first 5 years, then you like get your heart stomped on a bunch and you'll be fine. Shirkers is embodied with that soul. I kind of almost want to just send emails to my friends who I've had those conversations with, and like, you should watch Shirkers, because it's like a lot of things we've all worked on, and they've all worked on other films. They've all, like every woman, all the three women in this, Sandy Tan, Jasmine NG, I'm not sure how to say that, and Sophie Sandik, I believe. Their names will be down there, and I'm sorry to all of them because my bad pronunciation. They've all gone on to other things, and that's one of the things I think this film is very good at showing. It's showing like how this can consume your life to a certain regard, how you can get majorly bummed out. Sometimes you'll find, hey, this has another home doing something else, being a part of a documentary, being footage you'll donate to, some warehouse somewhere. Personally, I made a little film called Star Stalking, and nothing happened to it. It got submitted to festivals. I don't believe it got into any of them. But then years later, I cut it down majorly, made it into YouTube videos, and it took over, I don't know, like 15, 16 years for it to finally find its home and actually be something that people actually watch. That's just how it works, unfortunately. Or short films or things like that. A lot of this is pre-YouTube, which is film. This happened in 1992. Finally becomes a major documentary on Netflix in 2018, so that's pretty insane. Netflix seems to really like finding stuff that like has not been out forever and putting it on, which I respect, but I think this, not as extreme as Other Side of the Wind, but that's a pretty long time. I recommend Shirkers for anyone who makes film. I especially recommend it for people who've been making film or content or whatever the fuck you want to call it for a long time, because it is just like very much like going down the rabbit hole of one of those conversations. And I think Sandy Tan does a very good job of making that into a documentary. You can just go off of the mystery, and I think that's juicy and interesting enough to follow this documentary. I think she does try to get into the footage and be a little interesting with the editing of it, which I think generally works for it. It's obviously a very personal film, and sometimes those might sound easy, but I think this adds an aura of like looking into herself, looking into the situation, how her relationship with George was like wholly inappropriate and ridiculous, frankly, and looking at the film itself and like how she was into indie film and how she had a zine and like her whole artistic history before some of it passed, like how she became an author, how she was a film critic, how she doesn't like a lot of her work, which is interesting. I found it really fascinating, and I think it's one of probably the best documentary about filmmaking I've seen this year, and probably one of the ones I would recommend to people, because it not only shows you how devastating that can be, and naturally, by the way, I'm not saying if a project you worked on, I mean, she worked on an entire shoot. I mean, I've worked on stuff for years, and anyway, I don't want to get into it. Something about this film that was like, man, this feels like a little too real for me. A little bit. Just the natural, like, why did that happen? And when he just disappears with it, I'm like, why did he do that? Why is he so weird? Why didn't he just like, that's one of the things I think this documentary gets really well. It's like, there's a mystery to it, but there's almost like, who cares? They're just strange. At a certain point, you're like, you'll never know why. That's the other thing. You'll never know why. I mean, there's some things I've worked on, and it's like, you work on them forever, and then nothing happens. You're like, why didn't it happen? You're like, I guess, whatever. Anyway, man, I worked on this feature once, and I don't think it ever... You know what? I was telling myself before, I was just talking about the documentary, and we'll just list off major projects that I worked on that just never come out. But now that I'm shooting this, I'm like, well, there was that one film that I never put out, and then there was that other, and then there's the sound editing I did on the film that's probably lives on more in my reel on my YouTube channel than it does anywhere else. But anyway, but Shirkers brings up something in me. So in a way, how personal it was, I can relate to very much. And it felt very personal, and it very much reached into something in me and made me go, wow, that sucks, and I'm sorry, and it happens. And so I think this just gets into something in filmmaking or making content that is just the stinky ass way all this stuff works, and the bipolarness of working with other creative people sometimes, some of which are more about ego than actually putting stuff out, which is why I try to work with people who will just get stuff out. But trust me, you still get trapped into these people, or some of them start to change while you're working on them. You don't know. George, I think, was just someone who I think liked the process of being a certain person. He didn't like the process of making certain things, and that is ultimately, if you notice, you're like, hey, this person's so creative and amazing, why don't any of these projects work out? Oh, there's a reason. Trust me. If they've never put out anything and they're that old, there's a reason. I think this is a beautiful, awesome documentary. I haven't seen a lot of documentaries this year, but it's definitely one of my favorites. And it's interestingly directed and edited. I think Sandy Tan did a great job. Obviously, this is a lifetime's worth of journey of a film, and I think it definitely reflects that. And it feels personal while watching it, especially for someone who's made film. And I think Shirkers, while also going into all the mythos and the lost filmness of this thing, it really gets into everything you'd want from a film about this lost film, which would have also been called Shirkers. And I think Sandy Tan does an amazing job, and I'd be curious to see more things from her. But after kind of reaching into kind of her past and her filmmaking past and seeing what she was able to kind of repurpose it and make it into something as interesting as this really is, it doesn't just play as a lost media kind of YouTube video. It kind of goes into something more personal and a lot more like visual and interesting than any of that. And I think it is really a must-watch filmmaking documentary, especially for someone who's new in filmmaking, but it's probably going to reach into the soul for anyone who's been making stuff for a while and just make you sit there and go, fuck, I've been there. So if you've seen Shirkers and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.